us tonight, Florida Republican Senator Marco Rubio, who serves as vice chairman of the Intelligence Committee and also sits on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's also the author of the new book, Decades of Decadence. Senator, thanks for being here. A lot of people are trying to just distill what happened over the weekend. In your seat, you see a lot more than we do. Put it in layman's terms for us.
Well, it's actually like a mafia movie, and I don't mean to trivialize it. So Prigozhin has been more effective than the Russian military, and he's been rubbing it in their face for a long time, putting out videos. He's also good at putting out videos and social media stuff, basically showing his guys are strong and the Russian military is weak and their leaders are weak. And he eventually figured they're going to come for him at some point. He better go for them before they come for him. By them, I mean Gerasimov and Shoigu. So that's why he goes to Rostov, is to get his hands on them and try to maybe arrest them, put them on trial, kill them, whatever he was going to do. And he gets there and they're not there. But he takes over the Ministry of Defense, which is very embarrassing. He takes over their Ministry of Defense's operations, running the Ukrainian the war. And then he marches to the outskirts of Moscow. And I imagine at that point he has two choices. The first is he concluded, I've probably embarrassed these guys enough. I imagine Putin will now fire them because look how far I got on their watch. And the other is he probably calculated that he probably can't win an all-out assault on Moscow. And so here comes the fake president of Belarus with some promises. And so he takes that off-ramp. We don't know where he is now, but he takes the off-ramp. And then Putin goes on TV tonight and says, whatever they promised you, we're not sticking by it. You know, you're still going to have to face justice, which in Putin's world means, you know, death to him and maybe extended members of his family and those around him. That's my best guess that this was really a coup against the Ministry of Defense. And if it led to Putin leaving, that was fine too. But this was really what this was. And look, this guy is a former convict turned hot dog salesman, turned caterer, turned international mercenary. He's a vicious criminal, just as bad as Putin is in many ways, just without the power. And also a risk taker by nature throughout his career. So ultimately, I think he felt like they're going to come after him. He better go after them first and save himself and the guys that work for him. And that's what happened here.
Do you buy that just because this happened and how it happened, that it makes Putin look weaker internally and thereby raises questions about his future?
Well, I think two things that are going to make him weaker no matter what. The first is if Wagner's no longer involved in Ukraine, as brutal as they are, and these are terrible people, they're convicted murderers in that Wagner group that were let out of jail to go fight for them as part of the deal. So as brutal as they are, they were more effective than the Russian military. So if he loses them on the battlefield, they're going to face the impact of that. We don't know what the psychological impact is going to be on frontline Russian troops and even on their field commanders, because there's the reason to believe that those field commanders are not necessarily big fans of the Russian military leadership and the orders they've been giving. So we don't know what the impact it's going to be in the short, mid, long term on the war effort and the morale, which is already low by many accounts among Russian troops. And the other is we don't know what Prigozhin does next. He still controls, thousands of men under arms and well-trained, well-equipped, better fed than the Russian regular military is. We don't know what happens there next. And we don't know what else is going on within the internal machinations, because the third weakness is, although Prigozhin is a crook and a criminal, what he says about Gerasimov and Shoigu is true. They are incompetent, corrupt, and inept, and they remain in position there. So I think that's going to have a continued impact on the Russian effort as well.
Last thing on this, you mentioned the leader of Belarus. Do we know if nuclear weapons or materials have been moved to Belarus?
Well, I've seen no indications of that's been shared publicly with anyone. I certainly know and am aware of Putin's public statements about his intention to do so. But, moving even tactical nuclear weapons somewhere isn't an overnight thing. You've got to build highly reinforced structures to store it and secure it. So that would take some time. But the bottom line is that if the Russians wanted to store at least tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, they can do it. We would probably see it. Others would see it. They probably wouldn't hide it. Again, there's been no public acknowledgement of that, but we have to assume that at some point that will happen if Putin wants it to happen.
Speaking of intelligence, some people were waiting with bated breath for this release of declassifying what the intel community knew about the origins of COVID. It comes out Friday afternoon in this kind of dump of news, at which point the report says they don't know. Basically, the actions of the personnel at Wuhan leading up to in the early days of COVID-19 pandemic. The report does not address the merits of the two most likely pandemic origin hypotheses, nor does it explore other biological facilities in Wuhan. There's been multiple reporting now of the early days of these doctors having symptoms like COVID-19.
Right.
Here is Mr. Schellenberger, one of these reporters working on it. At the beginning, it was called conspiracy theories.
Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins' own scientific advisors thought it was more likely than not that the virus escaped from a lab, that they told them that in January 2020. I think this is potentially a massive scandal if what we're looking at here is that the U.S. government contributed to the creation of a global pandemic and then covered up its own role.
So where are you on that? Are you satisfied with this DNI report, or where are you?
I'm not. I don't think it's a coincidence it was released on a Friday afternoon when Congress was out of town. It still has a classified annex to it. When the law we passed basically said declassify everything. So there must have been a presidential national security exception to keep that. So I'm very interested to see the classified annex to see where it justifies it. Look, very rarely, this network, other networks carry murder trials all the time. It is very rare that you have a video of the actual murder occurring. But when you have a trial and there's all kinds of evidence, the DNA was there, the weapon matches the weapon that the assailant had in their hands, their alibi, the phone records were pinging the towers. I mean, we're going to see that in the Idaho murder trial. We've seen it in multiple. And that's the case here. What we're hoping for is some intelligence that shows that two scientists were on the phone telling, gee, hey, we have this pandemic, we caused it. That's silly. We may never see that. But I do think there's a tremendous amount of circumstantial evidence that, taken as a whole and combined with common sense, leads you to believe that the lab leak theory is the most highly probable, beginning with the fact that 2 years into this, 2.5 years later, the Chinese have not yet produced the animal. They've never come forward, unlike they did with MERS and SARS, and said, here's the animal with the virus. They still haven't done that. And on the other hand, we know, including from my own investigations, my staff released a report a month ago, we released a report from my office, that they were already talking about serious biolab safety incidents occurring there as early as the summer of 2019 and September of 2020. They were drilling for a pandemic. There was mentions of a novel coronavirus. All of this was not even intelligence. We were able to find it open source before they took it off the internet through a Mandarin-speaking employee of mine. All this stuff was put out there. The circumstantial evidence, in my view, is overwhelmingly now on the side of the lab leak theory, and I think eventually at some point that's going to be revealed, whether it's now or 30 years from now when some new government in China admits it.